Here we go.
Okay, welcome to the IUC and welcome to Professor Srinivas, who is visiting us from the New School of Social Research in New York. And he's gonna talk to us about his book, published by Cambridge University Press. It's called Against NGOs. And it is a very, very interesting critical piece of work that moves in a basically tries to match together two different traditions. One tradition is that of development studies, and the other tradition is that of management. So these are two apparently very opposed ways to see the world that Professor Srinivas had put together and made in dialogue with each other, using I would say, an historical or archaeological perspective, starting from the development of two very different traditions of research, both of them enjoying a quite important pedigree over time, and trying to understand how these two traditions merged, if not theoretically, at least de facto, in terms of the object of observations, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The globalization has produced a variety of new conditions, and these conditions have been challenging for now a long time, more than 30 years. What were the foundations of social science and social knowledge and academic disciplines, I would say, that developed, beginning in the second part, in the second half of the 20th century, within the paradigm of the Cold War. The Cold War had produced traditions of studies that were very different. I could say that development studies were, in a sense, I'm using very, very rough simplifications, but we can say that development studies were the brainchild of a vision that could be considered an emancipatory vision of the world. In other words, it's very famous the fact that Lenin himself, in 1918 or 1919, right after the seizing of power by the Bolsheviks, had claimed that the new socialist or communist political spectrum should be run through managerial strategies. So in a sense, we could say that management developed as some sort of a way to translate ideas that were taken and developed within the Western bloc, the capitalist bloc, mostly during the period of Roosevelt, but even clearly before that. And management studies were, in a sense, something that then ended up developing within a capitalist tradition, how to organize and manage mostly the corporation and mostly the economic subject and actors of capital. That could have been also used in socialist conditions if the managerial scheme, that is basically a strategy of depolitization from many points of view, could be applied with a different purpose. Okay. Similarly, on the side of development studies were approached as a way to try to emancipate mostly the global south. At the time we talked about third world, so a third condition, not just capitalism or socialism, but also the so-called non-aligned countries or non-aligned systems that were basically the object of confrontation and tensions between the two opposite blocs in kind of gaining, access to that kind of attitudes and words. And every model was trying to explain to the global south that if only they would follow capitalism in a certain way, things would go better on the one side. On the other side, if only they were becoming socialist, things would get better. And the things didn't get better at all, neither under socialism nor under capitalism. But the narrative was, in a sense, a competitive narrative. But development was certainly something that appealed as a target to everybody. Okay, but these traditions of knowledge developed separately. There were not really any real scholarly effort in trying to work out some theory that could be deployed in order to see what kind of impact has management and managerial skills gonna have on policies of development, and vice versa. You know, how development should change the way in which management would be conceived in order to adapt to the conditions of the global south, the conditions of extreme poverty, or the conditions where there were big chances to change and transform in a given direction. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, these two ideas, in a sense, became part of the same story. And it's very interesting, the role of the NGO, which is the object of critique of the book. What were, in a sense, how management entered into development, and clearly the role of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, but I would say more of the World Bank, was crucial from that point of view, because the idea was that you could not have development unless you were able to construct conditions in which markets could at some point develop and grow. Okay, and the World Bank basically had its target the target of the World Bank is written very nicely and large in their beautiful building in Washington DC. You know, we dream of a world free of poverty. That is written at the entrance of the building. And of course, you know, while they were dreaming about making the third world free of poverty, poverty grew worse and worse and worse, exactly because of the so-called structural development plans or structural development approach that was a way to universalize the conservative right-wing policy of Thatcher and Reagan first, then you know, in a way made the constitutional and mainstream by Clinton and by Tony Blair. Okay? So the World Bank is really the culprit, in a sense, of this sort of false consciousness that comes from translating approaches of management that are part of this very idea of corporate governance, translated into politics. You know, if governance becomes a concept different from the concept of government, governance is basically government without politics. Okay, and this is what the corporation was about, in a way, a government without politics. But over time, it was very clear that the power of the corporation became so important and so massive that denying the political nature of the corporation is basically the most political act you can possibly do. You know, you just hide what is really happening, and by hiding the political nature of issues and problems, the result is reactionary politics. You know, it's when you are neither right nor left, then you're right. You know, if you say it in a way that is a little bit simplified, but I think it's what is going on. So there was a big need of critique. There is a big need of critique. In reading the book, I thought of many works that were produced in the United States. I was very much influenced by my colleague and friend Laura Nader, who was always criticizing the so-called do-gooders. You know, do-gooders being those that claiming they were doing good, in fact they were doing stuff that were completely self-serving, yes, but presented in a sort of narrative and rhetoric of doing it for the others. You know, and the whole international aid is basically tainted by this approach. You pretend you're giving money to the development countries, but in fact you're giving those monies conditioned to the fact that the euro de facto, they will be then used by the Western powers to grow their own share of the market, and all the real the share of influence in those places, and all the real transformations are in fact hidden by that kind of strategy. So according to the book, part of this phenomenon is due to a kind of divide et impera strategy, in which you keep the different disciplinary approaches separated from each other, not looking into each other, not understanding from each other, and therefore not learning from each other's mistake. And I think that the book is doing a terrific job in filling that gap in the literature, which is not just a gap in the literature, is really a gap of understanding more generally, and I would say is a gap in the political understanding of the global geopolitical scenario these days. So what I would like to happen, if it's possible, is to have maybe 10-15 minutes in which you kind of draw the lines that you think are more relevant to your book, and then we should try probably together to discuss the present moment, which is the how to say, the solution of continuity that I believe happened in the second decade of our century, with the emergency strategy that began with the COVID pandemic, and then with the war narrative and all the transformations of society that is derived by that kind of approach, including, I would say, the clear emergence of what used to be called the Third World as a now large majority of not only the population of the world, but also of the world GDP, and also of the world structural power that requires probably exactly organization before becoming effective. I don't know if it's going to be organization in the sense of the management studies, or should be another different way to organize that uses all concepts but applies them to new conditions of the reality. So thank you very much for being with us, and you have the floor. Thank you very
much. Ugo has been kind enough to summarize my book, and I feel tempted to summarize what he's just said, because he said quite a few things which I'm very grateful this is being recorded, because I'd like to rehear them. But I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple of strands that Ugo's been kind enough to pull out from my book. One of them is the tension between international development and business management. As he's rightly said, neither of these fields talk to each other, but they're actually constituted by each other. To put it very bluntly, international development allows global corporations to function, and business management allows global corporations to contribute to development in terms of economic development. But it is telling that neither of them speak to each other, and the reason, as he said right at the end, is actually very obvious. It is because they find, and I'm quoting you here, Ugo, not myself, they find it easier not to learn from each other's mistakes, and they prefer a divide and conquer strategy, the imperium. A second comment that Ugo made right at the beginning, which I really think is worth cherishing, is that one of the earliest initiatives of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was one of Taylorism. When Lenin said very famously that the revolution will happen through electricity, he also said it would happen through Taylorism. So it was a division of labor that management would offer for not capitalism, but for communism. And so it is worth remembering that business management, despite its obvious problems as a discipline, has been in many ways a bedrock for a lot of technocratic visions, both on the left and on the right. The final thing I wanted to say is the unlikely figure of the NGO requires a little bit of explanation, and so with your permission, I have created some slides which I'll go through very, very quickly, and these slides essentially summarize the reasoning from my book, and I'll summarize that reasoning through a set of slides, but let me also do it immediately by making a couple of quick comments. The first comment I'd like to make is of all of you. I've known of the IUC's existence for quite a while, and I very honored to be here. I think that this is a very special educational institution at a time when essentially we're looking at war against education globally. And so for me as a human being and as a scholar, it's a matter of great honor to be here and to support what all of you are doing. I thank Giuseppe Mastruzzo, who I've known for some time, including a memorable lunch we had just as the COVID pandemic emerged, and Ugo Mattei for calling me here to the IUC. Many years back, I was a consultant, unpaid consultant for an NGO in South India, and I was taking part in what is known as a strategic planning exercise. And I noticed something very curious. Half the room did not speak English. Half the room spoke English. And so the word strategy had to be translated into the local language, which was Telugu. The word planning had to be translated. A vision had to be translated, so did mission. And as I watched this, I gradually realized that what I was watching was not the literal translation of words, but an accommodation of two very different discourses. One being the discourse of expert-driven technocracy interventions, and the other being the discourse of local social movements and their own efforts to grapple with the circumstances of what they were doing. That is the birth of my book. Gradually, I've come to the conclusion that the notion of an NGO encourages us to spend too much time, metaphorically, translating local idioms into global universal categories, which depoliticize what is happening at the local level. And to me, the NGO today is emblematic of all of this. Now, with almost no exception, I think everyone in this room has either worked in an NGO, been helped by an NGO, been oppressed possibly by an NGO, and has also in many ways supported NGOs. So I just want to start by giving you some sense of why my book is titled Against NGOs. So if you'll allow me, development NGOs have inspired me throughout my research, and they continue to inspire me. You can see behind, I've listed three of them: the Timbuktu Collective in South India, Sidesi, which is a social movement group based in the Chiapas in Mexico, and the Galpao Aplauso, which is based in Rio de Janeiro. I'm originally from India myself, but for the record, whether they are based in Mexico, speaking in Spanish, and Rio de Janeiro in Portuguese, or in Telugu in South India, all of these are deeply inspiring NGOs, ones I greatly admire. They take their work very seriously, they challenge taken for granted ideas, they urge a certain kind of politics, they cross a variety of boundaries, including between what is economical and what is political. And at the end of it all, they have a shared goal that I think we can all agree on, regardless of our politics, a goal of creating better justice and equality in the world around us. But despite their work, what you have at the moment is a dominant refrain in development that's very different. It's one that goes something like this. Non-state actors can achieve what states and markets cannot. They can, for instance, reduce poverty and generate development. And they can do it by themselves. They don't need help from the state or the market. And they can do it because they're very good at management. And this is a very unusual distinction. It's a distinction that's grown over the last 30 years. And as Ugo signaled right at the beginning, it's a distinction that might change, because as we see growing states of emergency and we see a different prominence to the global south, it is unclear what will be the role of the NGO in the future. But that's what interests me, and my book is a historical account of how this came about, how this notion of an NGO as a sort of a savior, a technocratic savior, emerged over time, and not a technocratic savior that works with the state and the market, but rather substitutes for the state and enables the market. And that to me is very interesting, theoretically speaking. So I'm going to basically go through a few stages, and I'm going to do this rather quickly. I hope to finish my presentation to you within about a half hour. I'm going to very briefly tell you the themes and writing approach of my book. That's going to be very short. I'm going to spend some time on common criticisms made of NGOs, and I'm going to argue that these are not sufficient as criticisms go. I'm then going to present the framework that underlies my book. Ugo admirably summarized actually the whole scope of my book, so I'm going to spend less time on this, but essentially talk a little bit about the conceptual stakes, or the theoretical stakes, if you wish, of this kind of a critique. I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing criticisms made of my book, critiques really, when I presented them elsewhere. This is not to be defensive, but it's rather to sort of generate what I feel is a healthy debate, because the issues underlying this book are issues that are not going to go away, regardless of whether my book is persuasive or not. And those issues concern me very greatly. And then I'm going to conclude by actually thinking what the prognosis is for the future. So I'm going to skip the slide, but very briefly what it signals is that NGOs have historically been seen as rank outsiders. It's only in the 80s and onward that NGOs started to be seen no longer as people on the fringes, but as actually very much part of the international development game, if you will. They actually were seen now as key implementers, as organizations that could achieve development goals and do so in ways that states could not. For instance, they could be more efficient, they could spend less resources, they could be more democratic, they could be able to talk to the grassroots more effectively than the government could. And that's very interesting that until the 80s, the NGOs were seen as outsiders, but after the 80s, NGOs started to be seen more, if you will, as part of the development sector itself. Now, my argument is that this sort of a notion of critiquing NGOs requires us to not dismiss NGOs as good or bad, but rather to understand historically how the notion of the NGO came about. So to me, the idea of critique here is, if you wish, a historical understanding and assessment of the notion of an NGO. And at the end, I'll briefly talk about a prognosis of what NGOs can achieve. Now, my book is basically uses two styles, if you will, and since both of those styles are going to be apparent in my presentation, I may as well signal what they are briefly. One is narratives. About 6 of the chapters are historical chapters. One of them is on the World Bank and Robert McNamara, who, in my view, was one of the crucial players in twinning international development and business management practices together, and in fact was the person who coined, if you will, the phrase structural adjustment. It was a phrase McNamara used in a conference of UNCTAD in Manila in the late 70s. I'm going to then, I also at the same time have a conceptual framework which begins the book and concludes it. And I therefore in my book move between two genres. One is a historical approach, where I literally describe the theories and the types of organizations that emerged in international development historically. And the other is a conceptual approach, which is what I was trained in social sciences, where I use certain concepts and apply them, if you will, and place them within tables and show how they function over time. So let's look at some common criticisms of NGOs, and let me explain to you why I think they missed the mark. Ironically enough, despite their prominence today, many dislike NGOs. In fact, they're not as popular as they used to be. And so criticisms of them have grown over time. One of the common criticisms of them is hypocrisy. It's one that was alluded earlier, that these are organizations that claim to do good and therefore acquire a certain virtuous capital, where we cut them a lot of slack, and they know this and rely on it. And so there are people who criticize NGOs for essentially hiding severe malpractice and waste beneath pious intentions, which are rarely met. A cynical joke in parts of Africa is that when you get a job in an NGO, you can enjoy life, pun intended. A joke in Nigeria, according to one research article I read, is that when you finish your education, you have only two choices. You can either open a church or open an NGO. The point of that joke, as you can gather, is both of them are built on a certain kind of evangelism and a certain piety that doesn't have to be tested. In the sense that, of course, if you believe in the church, it would be rather dangerous to ask the church to prove that God exists. So the second comment made about NGOs typically is their scale. NGOs rarely find themselves capable of collaborating with each other. What they're very good at doing is achieving certain project goals. What they're very bad at doing is actually networking and allying with each other. Part of this is outside their control. They're rarely given funds that incentivize them to work with other NGOs. They're usually given funds to prove they've achieved a certain project, which does not lend yourself to working with other organizations. And of course, project cycles require competing with each other to submit a budget proposal, which again means you're not going to cooperate with other NGOs. On the other hand, that really means that any NGO work done is very hard to both scale up and to sustain over the long run. A second criticism made is an inverse relationship between state capacity and NGOs. Studies in countries as diverse as Haiti and Bangladesh have shown that the growth of NGOs threatens governments and weakens them. So Haiti historically has had a weak state for reasons that should be obvious, the long history of French imperialism and then US imperialism in the region. And after the devastating earthquake in Port-au-Prince about 2 decades back, a lot of NGOs went into Port-au-Prince to work. They did not work with each other, they competed with each other, and they ended up weakening an already weakened state. And so Haiti is often called, rather disparagingly, as the Republic of NGOs. That's not meant to be a complimentary statement. However, there is one country in the world that does have, if you wish, a credible claim to be a Republic of NGOs. And that is Bangladesh, which has one of the highest NGOs per capita in the world. And which is also a country which has the birth of at least 2, if not 3, very innovative NGOs, the Grameen Bank, BRAC being 2 of them. However, if you've been following the news in Bangladesh, you'll know that the leader of the Grameen Bank is currently being investigated and is being threatened with life imprisonment for alleged violations of tax laws, which are to most interpreters are really the consequence of the fact that the government of Bangladesh feels threatened by NGO leaders and therefore intimidates them. So if we believe NGOs contribute to democracy, we will have to acknowledge they don't seem to have a positive relationship with all states. And it is unclear if they actually do contribute to democracy nevertheless. A third criticism made is that NGOs depoliticize, that NGOs strip movements of their mass base, that they shift politics into technically tractable tasks, that they take what is divisive and requires therefore a high level of controversy and make it into something that is palatable, uncontroversial, and therefore irrelevant in terms of the development impact. Let me give you a quick example. Imagine at the moment that you have a very strong view of what is happening in Gaza and in Palestine. There are studies that have shown women's movements in these areas that were very, very powerful, women's social movements through the 80s, through the first Intifada. And studies have shown that with a lot of funding from the UN and from aid agencies, a lot of these social movements became NGOized. They moved away from empowering women to conducting daily relief. They moved away from discussing the rights of women in a setting, which is basically a settler colonial state of Israel, and asking instead, how can these women be accommodated within day-to-day relief and day-to-day reconstruction? The shift away from politics to technical activities is often the key criticism made of NGOs. So overall, NGOs replicate an unjust social order. They offer palliatives, and instead of changing the world, though they claim they will do so, all they really do is keep the world going as it is. That, if you wish, is a summary of most of the criticisms made of NGOs. Now, I don't think these are in any way incorrect criticisms. I agree with them. I just think they're insufficient. For one thing, it's a little unfair. All we're really saying is you wish to do good and you don't succeed in doing good. And to me, that isn't quite the same as saying you're not doing good at all. Maybe the solution then is we all support NGOs and try to make them better rather than dismiss them as a notion. But I would argue that there are other very insufficient reasons, that the reasons given here are insufficient for other purposes in critiquing NGOs. So in my book, I basically argue that the notion of critique is not an evaluation. Critique is not where you're saying something is good or bad. Critique is actually embedding an object of study in its history. That's what critique is. Critique means essentially asking, how did this emerge? How did this come about? What effect does it have? What work does it do? Politically, what effects does it have, and do I agree with those effects? That, to me, is a credible basis to look at NGOs. To ask, where did the term NGOs emerge from? What work does this term do? Who benefits from NGOs? And what do we ignore by turning to NGOs? What are contradictions in the world around us that we're able to deflect by looking at NGOs? So to do that, I use a theoretical framework that's deeply shaped by Antonio Gramsci. And this slide summarizes my framework. I've deliberately kept it to one slide because I do recognize that these are quite dense ideas. And I'm not convinced the best use of PowerPoint slides is to present dense ideas. They're better engaged with through discussion. But essentially, I argue that NGOs are a notion that emerged within capitalism. Capitalism is not simply an economic system, it is a social system. We wouldn't function within capitalism unless we felt it made sense for us to sell our labor and to be consumers, and to accept that the world shaped in that manner is an acceptable world. That's what capitalism is. To say it is an economic system is absolutely true, but we shouldn't ignore the social system that underlies it. I argue that within that social system, NGOs have emerged, if you wish, through a process of ideational work to deal with the crises of capitalism. That essentially every time there is a crisis, NGOs are there to deflect how that crisis functions. So if we were to see capitalism as a social formation, our attention then focuses not only on economic processes, but on habits and beliefs, on ideas that we have, on the things we take for granted. And it's in those areas that I wish to now turn and look at NGOs. Very briefly, the ideas that I use in my book are deeply indebted to Antonio Gramsci's Prison Diaries. They're also indebted to Nancy Fraser's more recent work, as well as Giovanni Arrighi's book, his last two books on the history of capitalism, and also, of course, to Immanuel Wallerstein's Immanuel Wallerstein's huge ocean of world systems literature. Extraordinary output. So this essentially summarizes what I just told you. Let me briefly turn to two aspects here. One we're very familiar with. Capitalism, as we know, suffers from crises of accumulation. I'll call this as an internal crisis of capitalism. Capitalism as an economic system has a crisis of accumulation. At some point, those who are profiting from capital are no longer able to sell the products that are being produced because there's a lack of purchasing power of those who are unable to purchase those products. That's a crisis of accumulation. To put it very, very crudely, there are people right now with shares in Apple company, but Apple is not able to sell to parts of the world where people don't have money to buy Apple products. Eventually, those shareholders will face some sort of a crisis. That's a crisis of accumulation. Simplistic example. There is an external crisis, however, of capitalism that has nothing to do with accumulation. It has actually to do with administration and legitimation. At some point, a capitalist system reaches a point where certain problems within the system are no longer able to be tackled. So for instance, at the moment in the world we're in, there are countries that consume and produce coal. Australia and India are two such examples. Notably, China no longer is. It's actually moved its economy away from coal. Coal is one of the key aspects of global warming. The more we have coal production and coal consumption, the less the chance that we can actually halt existing levels of adverse climate change. And every one of the COP summits that has been held has tried to have some level of commitment of many countries to reduce coal production and hasn't succeeded. So this is an administrative crisis. Everyone knows coal production is dangerous, but the world is unable to create a capitalist system where those who produce coal are incentivized to stop producing it, right? Now, this sort of an administrative crisis is backed, if you wish, by a legitimation crisis. A legitimation crisis is when certain forms of value extraction are no longer acceptable. 150 years back, slavery was acceptable. 100 years, 80 years back, exploitation of women was acceptable. Presumably now it's reducing. We live in a world where certain forms of value extraction are no longer legitimate. At some point, an existing system becomes seen by people within it as illegitimate. So when you notice people of a very young generation spray painting Rembrandt or Da Vinci paintings in a museum, what they're really saying is, do you care so much for art when the world's coming to an end? When my generation is no longer able to enjoy what your generation enjoyed. Well, why don't we just spray paint this art? May I just state for the record, the paint that they use, I don't endorse what they do, but the paint they use is paint that can be removed. That is to say, they're not eager to destroy Rembrandt as much as to shock us into believing that Rembrandt, shock us into recognizing that we care more about Rembrandt than the fact that the world's coming to an end. This is an effort to create a crisis of legitimacy, right? So there are various places today where crises of legitimacy are happening, and there are various places today where crises of administration are happening. My argument in the book is that capitalism has historically had regular crises of administration and legitimation, and they've generally been dealt with through what I call ideational work. This is ideational.
Ideational. Can you spell it? I didn't understand.
Ideational work, I'll actually put it right up there. It's essentially a phrase to say the use of ideas
to
persuade people.
Okay.
So if you wish, you could simply...
Ideology.
Okay.
You could say ideology,
False
except
consciousness.
you could say false consciousness, but the reason I say ideational is it is unclear if it's false.
Okay.
That is to say, it is like a moment of hegemony. We can argue that the hegemony is false, but that is very different from saying we're still within a hegemony, right? And the reason I say ideational rather than ideology is to imply that it is not settled. That is to say, it's always a process. As Gramsci said, hegemonies are never permanent. They're always a constant war of position. So if you look behind me, you'll see the following terms: common sense, conceptions of the world, and hegemony. In the prison diaries, Gramsci uses all three terms. Most translations of the prison diaries tend to use the word hegemony to mean all of these, but Gramsci uses them in a very, very distinct way. So senso comune, common sense, is Gramsci's understanding of contradictory, taken for granted ideas that people may agree with, people may disagree with, but people never challenge because they're part of the way they see the world. For instance, about 60 years back, I would say the common sense globally was that, you know, the glaciers were in the Alps were about the way they were, that glaciers don't melt. While today it is probable that that common sense has changed. Gramsci does not say a common sense is accurate, false, or true. What he is keen on pointing out is that it is contradictory and untested. It could be true, it may not be true, but it is an important part of the way we see the world. And then a conception of the world is basically a common sense held by an organized group. And a hegemony is common sense and a conception that is now held by several organized groups. Let me give you a quick example because I recognize that my slide is unduly abstract. From about 1948 in Switzerland, the Mont Pelerin Society would meet every year. The Mont Pelerin Society was a society of people who were free market thinkers and included its founding president Friedrich Hayek and its most influential leader Milton Friedman and a variety of people who were economists and management thinkers as well as people in corporations and including in the UN. All of them had only one thing in common. You couldn't really say they were right wing because that begs the question what that term right means. But they all believed the market should be the crucial means of coordinating society and not the state. That wherever possible, the state should not intervene in society. In 1948, at the time when John Maynard Keynes helped found the Bretton Woods system, that notion of the free market was seen as crazy. And so the Mont Pelerin Society in 1948 was a fringe group that built on a set of common sense views, but it gradually became a conception of the world, and they had funds that allowed them to constantly mobilize support. And in the 1980s, the early 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, they found their opening, and what was then a conception of the world became hegemonic, and is what today we call as neoliberalism. Now, the story of the Mont Pelerin Society is well known. In fact, one of the well-known books on the Mont Pelerin Society describes them as a thought collective. And as you can gather, a thought collective and a conception of the world are actually very similar terms. So while Gramsci's views are not used in that book, I must say at the end of it all, we can see that there is a great affinity between Antonio Gramsci's ideas on ideational work and the way in which ideas are used to create different forms of hegemony. Now, one aspect of Gramsci's ideas that are very important to acknowledge here is that, as is very well known, Gramsci never saw civil society as good or bad. He saw civil society very much as part of the integral state. The state maintains its legitimacy through civil society. In the last week, I think because of the weather, I've been reading one of the biographies of Antonio Garibaldi. And I should say that Giuseppe Garibaldi. And I must say that when I've been reading this book, especially the sequence on Sicily, I constantly remember a phrase that is in Giuseppe Di Tomasi Lampedusa's book in Gattopardo, where one of the characters says, "For everything to remain the same, everything must change." And it is exactly that notion that Gramsci uses for civil society. Civil society is the realm of creating consent. It is where things seem to change, but they actually create the same. And the reason I was thinking of this when reading about Giuseppe Garibaldi is, of course, that is what happened in Sicily. Garibaldi goes in, instead of transforming a feudal order, he actually renegotiates that transformation into a new feudal order, no longer under the Bourbons, but now within what would become an Italian state. So Gramsci's ideas, I feel, are extraordinarily enlightening. And so when he's talking here of civil society, please keep in mind the Montpellier Society is a member of civil society. NGOs are members of civil society. And so in that sense, civil society is very much the realm where ideas are contested. Now, in the sequence, I'm essentially trying to summarize 3 different chapters of my book. I characterize how during liberal capitalism, the period when colonialism led to mercantilism and a high level of trade between colonies and the colonizers. During that same period, you had a severe set of legitimacy crises. You had anti-colonial movements, you had rivalry between the states, between the colonial powers, and they found various ways to withstand it. One of the ways they found to withstand it was non-state actors. They enlisted organizations like the YMCA, which worked very closely with the British government in India to underwrite the colonial state. They also worked with the British in Kenya and so forth. So you have always had a long history of non-state actors as part of civil society being used as mediators within these ideational crises. By the 1920s, after the end of the First World War, this order had broken down, and in that interregnum, before World War II emerged, non-state actors like Save the Children continued humanitarian work, trying very hard to keep the superpowers, if you wish, at bay. After World War II ended, after a very destructive war, you had the Bretton Woods Agreement, which again enlisted non-state actors such as Oxfam, which worked very closely in Nyerere, Tanzania, on cooperative movements, and in India with Indira Gandhi's government. All of these were efforts by non-state actors to be mediators within these kinds of crises. And then, of course, in the more recent times, we see the neoliberal period when NGOs emerged. So my argument basically is that if we look at the history of international development, what we actually see is not a history of achieving progress, how you define it. What we see is a history of a variety of ideas used to encourage a model of capitalism. And those ideas always are accompanied by non-state actors and are often mobilized in a war, if you wish, an ideational war on both sides, where some support the ideas, some don't, and they use them to back up rivaling visions of how to navigate within a capitalist system. The birth of the NGO is the rise of financial capital. By the late 1980s, the development world found NGOs to be an extraordinary figure to help create development. Because NGOs were efficient, NGOs were very close to the ground, NGOs were non-aligned, that is to say they were not part of the state or part of the market. And for these reasons, the NGO became extremely appealing. But for a moment, ask yourself, what does the term NGO mean? Literally, it means a non-governmental organization. It's a legal term that is in the Department of Public Information's website and can be traced back to the UN Charter. In the UN Charter, in one of its sections, it defines an NGO as a non-governmental organization with consultative role within the United Nations. When the Bretton Woods agreements were being negotiated and the UN was being created in San Francisco, there was a big debate on whether whether governments needed non-governments to also be there during a discussion. The United States said no. That is to say, the United States supported not allowing any non-governmental consultation within the United Nations. The Soviet Union said yes. The Soviet Union said, we would like non-governmental consultation to be allowed. If you think about it, in the late 40s, if you were a Bolshevik, would it not make sense for you to say that, right? You were supporting a variety of groups around the world that were challenging the legitimacy of colonial states. By saying non-governmental groups should be allowed consultative status, you were allowing the stranglehold of the nation state to be reduced a little bit. And that's of course what happened. So the NGO today is unrecognizable for what was meant to be the NGO in 1948. In 1948, it was a grouping, a political grouping that had credibility of representing people but did not have the legitimacy of a nation state. It had enough credibility for it to be invited, but not enough credibility to represent any vote. Today, any organization that is non-aligned in some sense can be invited to one of the consultative groups of the UN. The word NGO has in that sense diminished in meaning, broadened in applicability, but as a consequence had two dangerous effects. On one hand, it has lost any political meaning. It does not have any resonance in terms of a nation state anymore. And secondly, it has become basically a blanket term which allows people to gesture to a particular kind of organization without defining it. And that has a certain effect. If I were to say, I don't know why it's raining outside, it's because of an NGO, I don't need to ask why it's raining outside. I can say it's due to the NGO. If I say, I don't know why we didn't achieve the development goals, we'll hire another NGO. I don't have to ask myself whether they're actually similar in any way. One might be a cooperative, the other might be a grassroots group. One might be run outside the United States, the other might be an evangelical group based below. One might be working decentralized, the other might be centralized. But at that moment, they all become the same. And that's what I mean by the ideological effect of the NGO. In some ways, if you wish, the NGO, and I'm here thinking of Voltaire and a quote from one of his essays, if the NGO had not existed, it would have had to have been invented because it serves a purpose. It serves a purpose in mediating these kinds of crises. Okay, I'm now going to close, so let me very briefly, these are different parts of my book which summarize the conceptual framework that I've used. In each of these sections, I go through one of the periods, for instance, colonialism. I show the crisis, the common sense, the conceptions, the hegemony that emerged, and the different types of civil society roles that non-state actors had. Now, there are three critiques of my book that I find quite compelling, and I say this, another way to say this is I think that these are interesting critiques of my book, and I'm open to other critiques. If you look at the reviews of my book online, you'll find that these critiques are also echoed in these reviews. The first of these is, you're saying capitalism is ending, but there's no alternative. Well, I don't mean to sound apocalyptic. When I say capitalism is ending, I don't mean to imply that the Po is going to overflow and drown us all in another hour or so. I mean to say really that there's a certain social system in place right now, and that social system is fraying, and it's fraying in a very, very distinct manner. We were discussing earlier, if I may just state again, it is extraordinary. It is truly extraordinary that the United States is at the moment essentially sanctioning not only genocide against the people of Gaza, but is also sanctioning a war, an unprovoked war, if I may add, between Israel and Hezbollah, which could very easily lead to a further conflagration at a time when the European Union and the United States are fighting a de facto war with Russia in Ukraine. We are looking at an unprecedented situation of global instability. And in fact, I would go as far as to say during the Cold War, something like this would have been unthinkable. That leaders would be so reckless at such a moment does beg a question, why? And the short answer might be because it keeps people's minds occupied. It prevents them from looking at other crises that are taking place around them, or other crises that cannot be solved in some sense. I essentially think that we have to look at the ground. If there are alternatives to capitalism, they're happening around us. They're happening in terms of the way in which people of a variety of shapes and sizes globally are finding ways to create innovative markets, innovative forms of exchange, innovative forms of currency, or find ways to actually challenge what they see as inappropriate types of politics through economic means. A second criticism made is I generalize about NGOs and state that they're all bad. I hope I've made it very clear. I do not actually have any criticism here of all NGOs. My criticism is of the reliance on NGOs, ideologically speaking. And my criticism is of a laziness where we're not willing to define what NGOs are in the first place, and instead think that they're all somehow the same and don't need to be defined in that sense. I was once asked, what does your book tell us about how NGOs function at multiple analytical levels? I didn't write this book to actually describe how NGOs manage their work. It's a different book. I wanted to actually discuss the history of international development more closely. But I would say that what my book shows is that NGOs remain influential vectors for management ideas. Wherever we look, it is through management that NGOs claim to have some sort of a credibility. To put it very simply, NGOs believe they can manage development better than the state, either with the help of the government or without, but they see themselves as managers of development. And I think for those reasons, it would be really very important to recognize that it's their technocratic vision that has to be challenged. For instance, if they believe that this is going to reduce poverty by making the poor more entrepreneurial, it's worth testing that idea and asking them, is this really what you mean by entrepreneurial behavior of the poor? And do you think that's sufficient to reduce poverty? And finally, at a granular level, wherever we look at NGOs, it is the community actors who negotiate with them that also shape what is possible or not possible through these NGOs. So if I can conclude, and if you'll just allow me maybe about 5 more minutes to conclude this. You can see here that the king is about to fall and that the king's helpers are helping the king fall. There is a cat watching. I like cats, and therefore I admire this cat for not falling with the king and the king's helpers. I like this image a lot because it seems to in many ways sum up the world we're in right now, where we seem to be nearing a precipice. And many people are pointing to the precipice, and it doesn't stop us nearing the precipice. So if you look at the world in that way, it is unclear how much longer we can continue with the crises around us. Whether we're looking at global warming, high inequality, weak state controls, capitalism appears in many ways to be eating itself. To a quote from one of Wolfgang Streeck's essays. I would say that the figure of the NGO has to be changed for us to resolve these crises. We have to reclaim civil society. We have to see civil society, as Gramsci did, as a realm of contestation, as the place where consent is created. Not because we accept what consent is being created, but rather because we wish to challenge it. Consent has already been created. That's why NGOs are influential. It's time to challenge that. It's time to say, this is not what we want. This is not what we think NGOs should be doing. This is not what development should be. And that's something that no one of us can do. It's something we'll all have to do in a different ways, literally in actions of politics. Let me then offer you one way to look at this. This is a quote from Cornelius Castoriadis, which I greatly admire. I admire his work, but I also very much admire this quote. If you look at the highlighted section, Castoriadis is asked, what do you think is needed for a revolution? And are you a revolutionary? And Castoriadis says, of course I'm a revolutionary, but if you mean by a revolution the felling of the Winter Palace, torrents of blood, no. Because to a revolution is not about all of that. It's about changing the way we look at the world. You know, when the French Revolution happened, they changed their calendar. They literally changed their calendar overnight, and they renamed some of the months after famous composers of their time. And I think they did it because they really saw that as what was needed for revolution. And I think that's what Castoriadis is saying. In short, it would require a change in the way, it would require a change in hegemony. What would that look like? Well, perhaps here's one way in which we could look at that. We live in a world right now where economic growth isn't challenged. Every year, all the countries in the world reassuringly check their economic growth as if they're checking their body temperature, and they, in some cases, recognize that they're doing well because their growth is good. China isn't doing as well as it did, but it still has a positive growth rate. So does the United States. India is very happy; its growth rate seems to be doing quite well. But imagine for a moment that we stopped fetishizing economic growth. Imagine we actually fetishized degrowth. We actually said we're no longer going to increase our growth. We're going to actually agree to reduce growth in certain ways. That, I think, is one area of global common sense that could be challenged. And a variety of studies have shown that our current economic model, because it takes growth for granted, does not acknowledge its cost to the planet. And that a model of degrowth would actually be fair in a variety of ways, would reduce the cost to the planet. This is an extraordinary set of remarks made by the UN Secretary General last year. You can look at them on the slides later, but in a nutshell, the UN Secretary General states bluntly that none of the SDGs are being met. that in some cases the SDGs are in reverse. Global inequality has been at an all-time rise. Extinction risks are at an all-time rise, and we've even gone back on indicators of gender equality. In short, it's an extremely pessimistic view. He concludes this address by saying that there has to be a change in how global institutions are run, that the world we're in has to change its mindset. In short, he's echoing Cornelius Castoriadis. What he's really saying is that we have to change our notion of how we look at the world and recognize the trouble we're in. So in that case, the final slide, if you will, is a letter from the current President of the United States written to a former colleague, faculty member, I should say, not colleague, of mine at the New School. One of the great inspirations in my university, Hannah Arendt. In this letter, Joseph Biden asks Hannah Arendt for a paper which she had read. The paper is called Home to Roost, and these are the lines at the end of the paper. When the facts come home to roost, let us try at least to make them welcome. Let us try not to escape into some utopias, into images, theories, or sheer follies. Arendt is essentially saying that it is time for us to actually focus on a credible set of conceptions, ones that actually speak to a variety of individuals out there. It's time for us to create a hegemonic view that is genuinely representative, rather than, as was earlier alluded, rather facile effort at false consciousness. And that's what Castoriadis says in this quote right at the end. If we have to fight, the question really remains, can we work out a way to avoid catastrophe? Castoriadis says, we are rapidly reaching a point where we will know the answer. Either we will find a way, or we will have to reconstruct what we see as society on that basis. Thank you very much.
This was really an exceptional and thought-provoking presentation. I really thank you very much. It's a great contribution you're giving to this class, to our students. You know, we've been trying here in these small institutions to do as much as possible of that. You know, to try to be rigorous in our analysis, but not make discounts to, you know, the world around us and to the common sense from that point of the dominant one. So I would say that the best thing is to open the floor, you guys. I'm sure there is going to be a lot of questions. You know, we're fortunate enough to have students from many different parts of the world, so I'm sure that it's going to be interesting for you. Please.
Can I ask you more about your background, more about you? And
why don't you, before asking that, you tell him something about you?
Yeah, I will.
I think it's only fair.
At least where you come from and stuff.
Nice to meet you. My name is Matteo. I came from Turin, and I'm a student of IUC Master of Science in Comparative Law, Economics and Finance. I think you are from India, maybe?
I am.
And maybe India will be the new balance of the world now. Maybe not. But yeah, I'm curious about.
I did my PhD in a business school, and when I joined my university, I already knew I made a mistake because though I was very young, I was already radicalized, and I rapidly felt that the worst way one could spend one's life was to help corporations become wealthy. Because keep in mind, making a corporation wealthy doesn't mean you are wealthy. It simply means you're helping someone else be wealthy. And I was very alienated by my education in that sense. And so the only way I could deal with it was to rapidly read in the social sciences and in critical theory. And I became, in that sense, radicalized very quickly. And then it just was a question of keeping two individuals in balance, one being the person I felt I was, the other the person who needed to finish a PhD and find a job. This book was my way of finding a rapprochement between them, because I've always felt that there is a potential of management ideas to generate radical effects, but that requires radicalism to become more mainstream in that sense. So that's to give you some idea of who I am. If I may just say the following, the reason I mentioned Garibaldi earlier is because I'm very fascinated with Italy as a country. And just like Italy had a passive revolution, India had a passive revolution, though they're not comparable. Giuseppe Garibaldi liberated Sicily and helped create a new feudalism. And this is the subject in some ways of Gramsci's famous essay, The Southern Question. India became independent in the 50s, and in the process today we sowed the seeds of Hindu radicalism, because we never actually acknowledged very clearly how we separated our faith as a majority Hindus from our notion of an Indian society that was separate from religion. And so we are now bearing the fruits of that. I'm not convinced for these reasons that we can look at any particular country to lead us at this moment in terms of the situation we're in. I think that what will maybe make a difference is not countries as much as generations, or even economies. For instance, the tensions of social media create certain pressures that can actually become channeled towards democratic goals. And that could be a way to look ahead. But I'm not convinced that countries alone by themselves, whether they're India or other countries, can manage to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Emma, I think you were. Okay, you were first. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for this very enlightening talk.
Speak up.
I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you. And you just mentioned Gramsci's essay on the Southern Question. And I think one of your last sentences was also that we need a credible set of conceptions that can speak to
Yes.
many people. So in this essay, Gramsci, I think, mentions that what's really necessary to unite the agricultural classes of the south of Italy and the industrial workers in the north is that there has to be the emergence of some form of organic intellectual class, let's say, in the south. So to what extent do you think this idea of the organic intellectual is still relevant today, and how would this look like today?
No, it's
This is
wonderful.
Leo from Germany.
Leo,
I'm
thank
good.
you. That's a
Yeah.
wonderful question. Thank you very much. I think that the organic intellectual is very much alive. I just feel that we're not clear what is the base to whom organic intellectuals are speaking. If you look at NGOs, in fact, there's scholarship that talks of NGOs as brokers. And when they use the word brokers, what they're really saying is that NGOs mediate between different worlds. For instance, the world of constituents and the world of funders. But the use of the word broker itself damages the notion of the organic intellectual. Organic intellectuals are not brokers. Gramsci understood organic intellectuals, if you wish, as representing a constituency and speaking for that constituency. And if needed, negotiating with other constituencies. It is not quite the same as negotiating with the state or with funders. And to me, the big challenge with NGOs or with social movements or with civil society groups anywhere today is precisely this, that they find it very, very hard to articulate their goals, not simply as the goals of a set of communities, but instead they find it much easier to articulate the goals for one community alone, or for one region alone. Let's say, for instance, you're looking at people who are small-scale farmers. They find it very hard to articulate small-scale farmers as a group globally, or they find it much easier to talk of small-scale farmers in one particular area. And that lack of creating a shared consensus prevents exactly the kind of politics that Gramsci said was needed. It's a very, very good question. Thank you. This requires more thought on my part. I would also say that Gramsci makes distinction between the professional intellectual and the organic intellectual. To the extent that any of us study international development or business management, or in your case, let's say forms of applied and theoretical law, that is a tension that we will all have to tackle. To put it very simply, I think that distinction is not on whether we earn a living. I don't think that distinction is on whether we speak one language or the other, or even whether we're educated. It is simply who we speak for. To the extent that we lose the capacity to speak for constituencies and instead speak for other professional intellectuals, to that extent we are doomed in that sense. In the Gramscian sense, we are not able to be an organic intellectual. This is a major difficulty with my work. I constantly wish to find constituencies I can speak to and hear from. And I feel very frustrated by the obvious fact that I've been trained to essentially speak to other professional intellectuals. And this is something that I'm increasingly realizing I have to fight against. So I really thank you. You've helped me recognize this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Emma?
Hello, so first of all, thank you for this thought-provoking presentation and for the book itself, because it's not just a great contribution to the scholarly table, but also I think it's meaningful for a wider audience. I really appreciate that you expose all of the flaws and the contradiction of the main and dominant narrative in theory, saying that NGOs are inherently good and do-gooders, so trying to create this common sense of visual. You say Gramsci, but also Gadamer used to say that it's very dangerous, the common sense is a very dangerous attitude towards knowledge that tend to consider some notion as unquestionable. And in your book, you scrutinize this kind of what has come to be a symbiotic relationship between NGOs and business, NGOs and neoliberal economic agendas. So how do you interpret the existing legal frameworks and international policies that kind of facilitate the proliferation of NGOs within the neoliberal paradigm? And since I'm very interested in the pars consequens of the book, if I'm not mistaken, is in chapter 8, you say the possibilities of emancipation. So how could you elaborate a little bit more on how these policies and frameworks can be reimagined to foster a more like equitable and democratic civil society, not captured so much by market forces?
This is Emanuele Ariano, is our Deputy Academic Coordinator.
Emanuele, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have talked to you earlier, and thank you very much for this question. It's a very, very provocative, thoughtful question. At a very simple level, the answer is this. Overwhelmingly globally, the legislation that NGOs come under is legislation that prevents them from accepting foreign funds and from taking on political positions. So to put it very simply, the image we have of an NGO as a technocratic savior is reinforced by the legislation. NGOs cannot take up a political stand. They can't, and in many countries, they can't criticize or support a political party, including, I should say, in the United States. And they definitely cannot take foreign funding. So to give you two examples, in the United States, NGOs or the equivalent known as nonprofit organizations are registered under a 501c3 status. 501c3 means that you cannot take up any political stand. You can't, if you're an NGO, if you're a nonprofit organization in the US, you can't say I support the Democratic or Republican Party, because that's a violation of 501c3. However, you can be registered under 501c4, which allows you to be a lobbying group. However, most nonprofits find 501c4 very restrictive. They prefer to be under 501c3. Overwhelmingly, the legislation globally is not legislation to, historically, it's not legislation to restrict nonprofit organizations. It is legislation to allow them to pay less taxes. So it is really taxation laws that have now today been used for political purposes. So in India, historically, the taxation law was one reason why nonprofits were closely inspected if they received foreign funding. But today, under the Indian right-wing government, overwhelmingly foreign funding means nonprofits are under very close scrutiny, and so many nonprofits in India have just decided not to accept any foreign funding. Because if they accept foreign funding, the odds of them being under an audit, of being adversely affected, are much higher. And so they just find it much simpler to just not accept it. At the same time, prominent nonprofit organizations such as Amnesty International, Greenpeace, have been forced to close. They can't function in India anymore because of the hostile level of audits that they receive, the restrictions placed on them. So that's one response one could give. If we look at civil society as sort of a notion that encompasses the ideas of Aristotle, de Tocqueville, Hegel, and more recently of Habermas, and of course of Gramsci, then, and of Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, then we would understand that civil society cannot be seen as outside the market and outside the state. It is actually very closely linked to both of them, depending on the definition you have of civil society. most of the laws in place today reinforce the notion that civil society groups exist apart from the market and apart from the state. In short, they enact a legal fiction. And by enacting that legal fiction, they prevent us from recognizing the diversity of civil society in the first place. So the possibilities of emancipation require us to actually recognize that civil society and non-state action happen in a variety of places, in a variety of ways. And it is up to us to channel them in the ways we would like to. Yesterday, because of the rain, the Festa di San Giovanni prevented me and ensured I got wet even further. I'm usually very favorable to the Festa, but yesterday I became very annoyed because of the fact that through no fault of the Festa, I was becoming soaked. But the Festa is civil society. It's in fact a very interesting example of civil society, because though it is funded by the state, it is historically part of the tradition of Torino. You're very near Don Bosco's charitable institutions. They're very much part of civil society. That does not mean they're necessarily good or bad. They exist in a shadow area where the funding of the church enabled Don Bosco to reduce the social unrest in Torino in the late 19th century. So in these consequences, I feel we really lose the ability to see how civil society is not a unitary actor achieving a set of goals. It's actually a fabric of the society itself. And it is only through that fabric that we can engage with the reality of that society and how to improve it.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you for your presentation. I was actually intrigued by one of the phrases that you mentioned when you were talking about the critique, about fetishizing of degrowth. I want to understand first, what do you mean, or can you translate the term when you mention degrowth, and then the phrase? Because
Yes, thank you. I very much appreciate you asking me that, because I don't think it's correct for me to say we should fetishize degrowth. Fetishizing is, there are various meanings of it, but essentially it's a term which in psychoanalysis is where you take something and you invest an extraordinary level of non-human power to it. So for instance, those of you, and I'm in no way blaming you, those of you who keep your phone next to you, and every time it blinks, you immediately look at it, you're fetishizing your phone. And the reason I removed my watch and left it there, I hope I don't forget it, is generally when I'm presenting, I keep checking the time. I fetishize my watch as a boundary of time. Growth, the notion of growth is fetishized globally by the media, by economists, by government leaders. If India tomorrow registers zero growth, it'll be a major crisis, and certainly it's not going to happen, but if it did happen, no country would have an incentive to declare it. They will find ways to ensure they show that there's no zero growth. But what exactly is the problem with zero growth? Zero growth means an economy has not grown. It does not mean that there's no longer the possibility of employment within the economy. It does not mean that there's no longer a possibility of reducing poverty in the economy. It doesn't mean that there's no longer a possibility of people buying things in an economy. It simply means that you'll now have to find another way to do it rather than keep turning to the growth of the economy to do it. You'll have to find another way to essentially create that distribution. Another way to put this is, in any one country, let's say certainly not Somalia, but certainly possibly Italy, there is a lot of wealth that is locked up in certain areas. In a circumstance where the economy doesn't grow, that wealth can be shifted into other productive uses. That doesn't necessarily mean people even have to let go of their wealth. It could be invested and given back to them in interest. It's another way of looking at how an economy functions. Now, the reason I said we should fetishize degrowth, and I apologize for using that phrase fetishize, is when we live in a world where growth has become a fetish, where every year we turn and say, okay, this is the level of growth this country has had. I've been surprised by the number of people I can meet in India and elsewhere who can automatically tell me the Indian growth rate and the Chinese growth rate and the US growth rate. Three levels of percentage, which I would think are in some ways inconsequential, but most people would say are not. They're very important. But if we were to move away from that, we would actually be saying, what is the level of growth you are willing to peg? Are you comfortable keeping your growth at 2%? Because if you keep it at 2%, that's the level of consumption of the global planetary resources you will not need. And is there another way you can talk of your growth? Instead of, let's say, you're saying I've had 8% economic growth, can you say, okay, what is the cost to the planet of 8% economic growth? And can you reduce that cost every year? It's to recognize that there are different ways to talk of growth and of economic prosperity that reduce our use of certain vocabulary and the positive connotations we associate with it.
Yeah, if I can add just a very quick comment, it's like fetishizing exchange value over use value.
Yes, exactly
If you can
Yeah.
organize and imagine a common sector,
Yeah.
that would be based on use value, and of course it would create a degrowth in the sense of exchange value because you're taking away some of
Yeah.
the value from the exchange of the use.
Exactly.
And that doesn't mean that you're not satisfying better the needs
Yeah.
of the people. That I think is pretty much.
That's exactly so.
Yeah.
In fact, if I may also just say this, and this is my comment, it doesn't have to be Ugo's. The IUC, to me, one of the things that's fascinating about your educational institution is precisely this, that you keep pushing against exchange value for use value. While I should say in all the universities I know, including regrettably in the new school, despite faculty resistance, we constantly are battling the exact opposite. The growing use of exchange value over use value. So for instance, education not as something that happens everywhere, but education is something that you have to value within a classroom within certain hours and justify it as an investment. The more we go towards exchange value, I don't mean to sound romantic when I say this, we actually lose the condition of education. That is what education is. Education is removing of boundaries. And if we retain those boundaries and reinforce them, including the boundaries of the market, I'm not convinced it's actually education. To go back to your comment, it is closer to what a professional intellectual is meant to do. Reinforce a vision of what the market's meant to do.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentations.
Speak up, please.
Yeah, I really found your presentation very insightful. My question is with regard to, just you have tried to pose some issues regarding depoliticizing NGOs with regard to the common criticism on NGOs. My question is, from my experience, especially from my home country, there are these days big reforms which are being made, especially regarding civil society laws. And there is this new law, which is just assumed to be it's a reformed law, which really will encourage NGOs to work more towards development or sustainable development or others. And before, we used to have this previous law, which totally prohibit NGOs not to engage in any business activities. But now, currently, we have a new law, under the reformed law. The law allows NGOs to engage in economic activities, to do businesses.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as these NGOs use this turnover that they get from this business for humanitarian activity or some other things. So I always, I'm a little bit cautious about this, that this allowing NGOs to do business activities is an attempt to depoliticize NGOs and push them towards a business, or it is an attempt by government to avoid an aid-dependent NGOs. There is this, I'm also fascinated by this Dambisa Moyo's book, The Dead Aid, maybe you might have read it, and she tried to a little bit give much focus on this about ineffective allocation of resources toward these NGOs, and the NGOs are not reaching the target populations, and she tried to criticize this aid dependence also. NGOs are aid dependent and other things. So how do you evaluate these new laws? It's becoming a common trend in Africa these days that NGOs are being allowed to do business activities and channeling NGOs to do in the name or in the facade of self-financing and others. NGOs are these days being allowed to do businesses so that they will finance their own operations or other things. So how do you evaluate these new laws which are being promulgated in developing world?
Can I quickly ask you one question? May I ask which country you're from?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia.
Yeah.
As you know, in Ethiopia now, NGOs are even allowed consultation in the parliament. I believe that NGOs are allowed an NGO council, one representative who sits in the House,
Yeah,
which is very unusual, even across the world at the moment.
Yeah.
There's no country I know where NGOs actually, in this sense,
Yeah.
are part of the political system, though it's literally one person.
Yeah,
Even
yeah,
then.
I know.
Yeah. So I think it's a very important question you're raising. I'm not convinced that we can argue that politicization happens simply, depoliticization happens simply because you allow the market in. Markets can be highly political, and they can have political effects. So for instance, imagine there's an NGO that is helping village women somewhere in Ethiopia become wealthy in what they're doing. It will have very severe changes in the gender distribution and gender power within the rural area. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that governments are doing this, but I do suspect that they don't recognize that it can be destabilizing. That is to say, if the government realized that by encouraging NGOs to be more commercially oriented, that it could have unintended political effects, if they knew this, they would be more careful. So it's a good thing in that sense. Also, if the flip side is true, let's say that you prevent them from doing commercial work, they can still depoliticize. Depoliticization doesn't happen because you are trying to make a profit or not. Depoliticization happens because you focus on the immediate task and you are not interested anymore in debating what is the goal or the consequence of achieving that task. That's really what depoliticization is. So the more an NGO becomes task-oriented, the greater the chances that it will essentially become a technical instrument and not have any political consequence.
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead. Then maybe.
First of all, thank you very much for this exciting presentation and your book, and I think it's really great endeavor to work on this issue. And my name is Evgenia. I'm from Russia. So while we were talking about critiques of NGO, like usual critiques, one of the point was that they are not cooperating or aligned to each other because they are actually competing for fundings, right? And then they are promoting the development, but in the end, behind the development is also the promotion of capitalism and of capitalist interests. So by doing the NGOs politics, they actually are making some agents better off while others worse off. And in this sense, I feel like there's some connection with another instrument usually used internationally, while agents in the other countries are financed by the country of origin in order to provide right policies, to provide strategies and everything, to scrutinize mass media for promoting of democratic development of these countries. So my question is, do you see these two processes are interconnected and are they part of the same politics, or they are absolutely separate and they don't actually do anything to each other?
Could you remind me of the two processes again that you described?
Yeah, the first one, the activity of NGOs in countries for promotion of development, and the other one is the activities of some specially funded agencies in order to promote the democratic development.
Ah, wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. And I'm especially delighted that you're from Russia when you ask this question. There is one vision of civil society that is especially unique to the United States. And it is a vision that originates from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and the way that has been interpreted and then used to essentially create a field of nonprofit management. Within that reading of civil society is seen as creating democracy. And civil society is therefore something that certain countries don't have, especially countries that are not democratic. So from the moment that the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia became an independent country, the USAID started to fund pro-civil society groups in Russia, in Ukraine, in various places that were historically behind the Iron Curtain, in the expectation that this would generate democratic outcomes. And this hasn't changed. If you look at the USAID website right now, they're still doing the same, except they have now moved to other locations, some obvious suspects such as Iraq and other places. Now, this is very obviously a facile notion that, forgive me for being blunt, but that no intelligent human being should be holding. Why would you assume somehow that creating civil society generates democracy? And what does one mean by democracy, and how do we know what democracy looks like? And maybe, you know, if you are in a country that has historically been under the communist state, and you place funds available, what makes you think those funds will automatically lead to democratic effects? And a series of research now has shown that USAID funding in Russia and elsewhere has actually not had that effect. And so to go back to your question, the two are not related.
Yeah.
In short, what happens is that they function in each, if you wish, they each function in a circle of virtuous intention. There are groups that come in and say, we are offering funding for democracy. And that funding is used for meetings of people, visits to remote areas, and then they say we have accomplished democracy for that funding. And then there are groups that are courageous and seeking to challenge existing power structures. Sometimes they get funding, sometimes they do not. Sometimes they're repressed by the local government, sometimes their external governments have repressed them.
Yeah, you get another question from Russia now. Yeah.
My name is Nidhi.
Thank you.
My question is, since many global NGOs are criticized for lack of local representations, and since you mentioned several successful NGOs which operates on a global scale, so what, in your opinion, are their distinctive features that make them successful in terms of local representation?
Of the global NGOs?
Yes.
They tend to be heavily decentralized. They make a great effort to have local leaders in the NGO, not international. So if it's a local NGO branch, the leader and the main staff are all from the local area. They're not outsiders, they're not foreigners if you wish. They're heavily decentralized, they have their own budget, they have their own project cycle. They are encouraged to function independent from each other. And in some exceptional cases, they even create their own consulting groups. So Oxfam, for instance, had Oxfam America, which then became an independent entity. Oxfam Canada, that became an independent entity. Now there's an Oxfam family where different Oxfams all consult with each other. But there is no coordinating group that tells them what to do. So Oxfam is in some ways a good model of the advantages of this kind of a operating structure.
So answer is in this decentralization.
It's severe decentralization. That is the answer.
Is that what you wanted to hear?
It's not easy to do.
Thank you for your answer.
It's my pleasure, but it isn't easy to do. But it is very, it's severe decentralization with local leadership.
And then more?
There is a second question by Leo, but perhaps
Yeah.
there is
One
someone
second
who
by Leo,
hasn't.
second by Matteo. So first Matteo, then Leo. Then if other wants to talk, let's just say it now, and then we close after this. 2 or 3 more.
Do you think, when do you think that grow becomes a common, and which is the relationship between commons and what you say just?
Your question is, when does capitalist growth support the commons, and when does it not support the commons?
Is like a commons. When is a shared growth become a commons?
Shared growth. Well, I mean, look, in generally my understanding of everything I've said, capitalist growth destroys the commons. That is, so it is an antithetical relationship. So if you wish, growth means destroying the commons. Degrowth can mean reclaiming the commons. There are a lot of authors who argue this, but you know, if you look, for instance, my perception as someone who lives in New York City is that Turin, thank goodness, is not sufficiently capitalist. If it was, I would not be able to survive in most of the places. Today I went to a place, didn't have a coffee, and just worked there for 2 hours. No one stopped me because that space is a kind of an arbitrary space. So it's not a private establishment, it's not a public establishment. Similarly, I can go to libraries and use them. These are spaces that have existed historically here because of the unique civil society in Italy and in Turin. Capitalist growth generally commodifies everything. If you commodify, you no longer can share. Its use value becomes exchange value, which in turn becomes individual usage. So degrowth is, in that sense, a reclaiming of the commons. However, degrowth alone doesn't mean reclaiming the commons. You do need effort You can't just, it doesn't happen automatically. That's why degrowth isn't simply an initiative of economists and of government leaders. It's a political effort. It's where people say that we wish to reclaim use value. We feel that commodification is no longer the way.
Leo?
In one of our other lectures with Nora McKeon, we also talked about NGOs a lot because she taught the course on food governance. And one crucial distinction she made was between people's organizations and NGOs. So I was interested in this because of your comment regarding Oxfam and decentralization. So what do you think, like where does the distinction start? Where, like at what point would Oxfam actually become a people's organization?
Yes, this is the underlying reason why I very strongly believe the word NGOs prevents us from a discussion of development and of civil society, because we don't really know where that boundary exists. One way to answer that is to give you an answer, which is much simpler. I don't agree with that answer, but the simple answer is this. People's organizations have representative membership. They have a system of democracy, so that the moment Oxfam starts to say you're an Oxfam member, you get a certain return on the money you give us, and therefore you now have a vote in how Oxfam functions. That would become closer to a people's organization. Of course, given the history of Oxfam, that would be very hard to do. Some would say it's also not desirable. Keep in mind, Oxfam was historically funded and led by relatively affluent people in Britain trying to give funds to relatively poor citizens elsewhere in the world. And it was very controversial when Oxfam started to actually give funds to people within Britain itself, which happened only about 5-7 years back. But the reason I am not satisfied with what I just told you is it is very, very hard to establish what are the key definitions of people's organizations. It is healthier to recognize the diversity of civil society. So I completely agree with your colleague, Professor McKeon. People's organizations are very effective. The challenge is trying to recognize the variety of these organizations, how they function with each other, how they function with aid agencies, with intermediary groups, and the crucial question, how they can actually generate something like a credible set of goals that they seek. To go back to what you said earlier, Leo, how they can function as organic intellectuals, work for a constituency they represent.
Good? Please?
Don't you think that an NGO that operates maybe in a crisis context cannot be political? Like you cannot be political, you cannot take a side, because if you take a side you put in danger all your work. And you have, for example, there is Emergency born is an Italian NGO that born in Afghanistan, is recognized by Taliban, by also other groups as the most reliable one, because Emergency used to give treatment to everyone, to the Taliban and also to the civil society. So this is a good way to not be political but still pursue your aim.
I understand.
But Emergency was very political abroad, though.
Yeah.
So,
but
so
not
it's, in a way, Emergency is very interesting from that point of view, because you're absolutely right. They were very sensitive of local conditions, which is something that usually American NGOs are not.
Yeah, that's right.
They tried to violently impose the vision of USA, basically, if I can put it a little bluntly. Whereas Emergency was actually very, very special from that point of view, because Gino Strada himself was a very sensitive individual, but he was extremely political back here. And where he felt, basically he felt in a way that the political activity is locally to be exercised in the place where you are from, in some sense. You don't go to do politics
exactly abroad.
I mean, if I may just add two other things. First of all, the fact that they were willing to work with the Taliban is a political statement right there. Because as we know, there are many groups that are either saying they are unwilling to do so or are facing criticism because they do so. And this could very much be because of their vision and their commitment to working with local actors. But to me, it's a political gesture and a credible one under the circumstance. But the other thing is that I want to make a distinction between taking a political stand and achieving a political effect. So let's say emergency goes in, and like many US NGOs will say, we will work with the Taliban only when you commit to educating women and children, and educating them as we see it. Let's say that's the unnegotiable position. What my limited understanding of the Taliban right now, that's not something they're willing to do. And so obviously that's untenable. That's a political stand. And I agree with you, it's not credible or flexible to do that. But by emergency working with the Taliban, there's no reason to believe political effects won't happen. And some of them may be political effects we desire. For instance, for all we know, by educating people, they may actually indirectly be educating women. Maybe they're allowed to educate women, but under terms that the Taliban offers, right? And if I may add one other thing, you know the tension between the International Red Cross and MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières. MSF was created because at one point they were prevented from criticizing what was happening in Biafra and elsewhere, while the ICRC has historically always been committed to neutrality. The ICRC does not comment on what is happening anywhere. In fact, it's their founding goal. So this notion that emergency has is in that sense not unusual. It is part of a reaction of many humanitarian actors who believe that taking a political stand is not necessarily a bad thing, provided it allows you to survive. If you look at MSF, they take political stands, but they're very, very careful where they take them, and they generally don't take them very often. And when they do so, they're not necessarily stands we would agree with. At one point, MSF was very neoliberal in its views, historically, and of course, its founder remains someone who's very controversial for those reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may just
One more.
Yeah, thank you. So, I was thinking about the situations when local communities are quite suspicious about the NGOs' activities, and what I have in my mind is something regarding vaccination, for example. So what I was thinking about, is there any way or legal instrument to, first of all, provide some credibility test for which local community or society can have, or maybe some legal instruments when NGOs are obliged to claim or to declare something which they actually will be then responsible for, so that local community has some guarantees that the activities of NGO does not influence their life in a bad way or something like this. And just
No, there's absolutely none. NGOs, there's often an effort by NGOs to create a charter, like a charter of responsibility. So you could say there are NGO groups globally in different places that are trying to create something like this. But it is one thing for NGOs to try to create it, another for local communities to demand it. And most studies of effective NGO intervention show that NGOs are generally kept accountable by strong communities. And if you take a snapshot of these moments, you have a strong community, you have grassroots leaders, you have some level of homogeneity and cohesion. That makes the NGO become more eager to deliver. It is not the state necessarily. The state can often demand NGOs deliver, but what the state demands they deliver is measurable and is not necessarily what communities want. And so there are, if you wish, there's a metric of the state's demands of NGOs, but there's an accountability NGOs can have to local communities. But that requires strong political cohesion within the local community. Otherwise, no, it doesn't happen. Generally, severely donor-driven funding tends to have a very adverse effect for NGO accountability, because what it leads to is that the NGO becomes more accountable to the aid agency and less to the community.
okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
So thank you very much.